Section 7 of Orpheus in Mayfair and Other Stories and Sketches. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Orpheus in Mayfair and Other Stories and Sketches by Maurice Bering. A Luncheon Party. Part 1. Mrs. Bergmann was a widow. She was American by birth and marriage, and English by education and habits. She was a fair, beautiful woman, with large eyes and a white complexion. Her weak point was ambition, and ambition with her took the form of luncheon parties. It was one summer afternoon that she seized with the great idea of her life. It consisted in giving a luncheon party which should be more original and amusing than any other which had ever been given in London. The idea became a mania. It left her no peace. It possessed her like venom or like madness. She could think of nothing else. She racked her brains in imagining how it could be done. But the more she was harassed by this aim, the further off its realization appeared to her to be. At last it began to weigh upon her. She lost her spirits and her appetite. Her friends began to remark with anxiety on the change in her behaviour and in her looks. She herself felt that the situation was intolerable, and that success or suicide lay before her. One evening towards the end of June, as she was sitting in her lovely drawing room in her house in Mayfair, in front of her tea table, on which the tea stood untasted, brooding over the question which unceasingly tormented her, she cried out, half aloud, "I'd sell my soul to the devil if he would give me what I wish." At that moment the footman entered the room and said there was a gentleman downstairs who wished to speak with her. "What is his name?" asked Mrs. Bergmann. The footman said he had not got the gentleman's name, and he handed her a card on a tray. She took the card. On it was written, "Mr. Nicholas L. Satan, 1 Pandemonium Terrace, Burning Marl, Hell. Telephone number 1 Central." "Show him up," said Mrs. Bergmann, quite naturally, as though she had been expecting the visitor. She wondered at her own behaviour, and seemed to herself to be acting inevitably, as one does in dreams. Mr. Satan was shown in. He had a professional air about him, but not of the kind that suggests needy or even learned professionalism. He was dark, his features were sharp and regular, his eyes keen, his complexion pale, his mouth vigorous, and his chin prominent. He was well dressed in a frock coat, black tie, and patent leather boots. He would never have been taken for a conjurer or a shop walker, but he might have been taken for a slightly depraved art photographer who had known better days. He sat down near the tea table opposite Mrs. Bergmann, holding his top hat, which had a slight mourning band round it, in his hand. "I understand, madam," he spoke with an even American intonation, "you wish to be supplied with a guest who will make all other luncheon parties look, so to speak, like 30 cents." "Yes, that is just what I want," answered Mrs. Bergmann, who continued to be surprised at herself. "Well, I reckon there's no one living who'd suit," said Mr. Satan, "and I'd better supply you with a celebrity of a former generation." He then took out a small pocket-book from his coat pocket, and quickly turning over its leaves, he asked in a monotonous tone, "Would you like a philosopher, Anaxagoras, Aristotle, Aurelius M.?" "Oh, no," answered Mrs. Bergmann with decision. "They would ruin any luncheon." "A saint?" suggested Mr. Satan. "Antony, ditto of Padua, Athanasius, Augustine, Anselm?" "Good heavens, no," said Mrs. Bergmann. "A theologian, good arguer?" asked Mr. Satan. "Aquinas, T?" "No," interrupted Mrs. Bergmann. "For heaven's sake don't always give me the A's, or we shall never get on to anything. You'll be offering me Adam and Abel next." "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Satan. "Latimer, Laud, historic interest, church and politics combined," he added quickly. "I don't want a clergyman," said Mrs. Bergmann. "Artist?" said Mr. Satan. "Andrea del Sarto, Angelo M., Apelles?" "You're going back to the A's," interrupted Mrs. Bergmann. "Bellini, Benvenuto Cellini, Botticelli?" he continued imperturbably. "What's the use of them when I can get Sargent every day?" asked Mrs. Bergmann. "A man of action, perhaps? Alexander, Bonaparte, Caesar, J., Cromwell, O., Hannibal?" "Too heavy for lunch," she answered. "They would do for dinner." "Plain statesman? Bismarck, Count, Chatham, Lord, Franklin, B., Richelieu, Cardinal?" "That would make the members of the cabinet feel uncomfortable," she said. "A monarch? Alfred? Beg pardon, he's an A. Richard III, Peter the Great, Louis XI, Nero?" "No," said Mrs. Bergmann. "I can't have a royalty. It would make it too stiff." "I have it," said Mr. Satan. "A highwayman, Dick Turpin, or a housebreaker, Jack Sheppard or Charles Peace?" "Oh, no," said Mrs. Bergmann. "They might steal the Sevres." "A musician, Bach or Beethoven?" he suggested. "He's getting into the B's now," thought Mrs. Bergmann. "No," she added aloud, "we should have to ask him to play, and he can't play Wagner, I suppose, and musicians are so touchy." "I think I have it," said Mr. Satan. "A wit, Dr. Johnson, Sheridan, Sydney Smith?" "We should probably find their jokes dull now," said Mrs. Bergmann thoughtfully. "Miscellaneous?" inquired Mr. Satan, and turning over several leaves of his notebook, he rattled out the following names: "Alcibiades, kind of statesman; Beau Brummel, fop; Cagliostro, conjurer; Robespierre, politician; Charles Stuart, pretender; Warwick, kingmaker; Borgia, A; Pope, ditto, C; toxicologist; Wallenstein, mercenary; Bacon, Roger, man of science; ditto, F; dishonest official; Tell, W; patriot; Jones, Paul, pirate; Lucullus, glutton; Simon Stylites, eccentric; Casanova, loose liver; Casabianca, cabin boy; Chico, jester; Sayres, T, prize fighter; Cook, captain, tourist; Nebuchadnezzar, food faddist; Juan D, lover; Froissart, war correspondent; Julian, apostate?" "Don't you see?" said Mrs. Bergmann. "We must have someone everybody has heard of." "David Garrick, actor and wit?" suggested Mr. Satan. "It's no good having an actor nobody has seen act," said Mrs. Bergmann. "What about a poet?" asked Mr. Satan. "Homer, Virgil, Dante, Byron, Shakespeare?" "Shakespeare!" she cried out. "The very thing! Everybody has heard of Shakespeare, more or less, and I expect he'd get on with everybody, and wouldn't feel offended if I asked Alfred Austin or some other poet to meet him. Can you get me Shakespeare?" "Certainly," said Mr. Satan. "Day and date?" "It must be Thursday fortnight," said Mrs. Bergmann. "And what your terms?" "The usual terms," he answered. "In return for supernatural service rendered you during your lifetime, your soul reverts to me at your death." Mrs. Bergmann's brain began to work quickly. She was above all things a practical woman, and she immediately felt she was being defrauded. "I cannot consent to such terms," she said. "Surely you recognize the fundamental difference between this proposed contract and those which you concluded with others. With Faust, for instance, they sold the full control of their soul after death on condition of your putting yourself at their entire disposal during the whole of their lifetime, whereas you ask me to do the same thing in return for a few hours' service. The proposal is preposterous." Mr. Satan rose from his chair. "In that case, madam," he said, "I have the honour to wish you a good afternoon." "Stop a moment," said Mrs. Bergmann. "I don't see why we shouldn't arrive at a compromise. I am perfectly willing that you should have the control over my soul for a limited number of years. I believe there are precedents for such a course. Let us say 1,000,000 years." 10,000,000, said Mr. Satan, quietly but firmly. "In that case," answered Mrs. Bergmann, "we will take no notice of leap year, and we will count 365 days in every year." "Certainly," said Mr. Satan, with an expression of somewhat ruffled dignity. "We always allow leap year. But, of course, 13 years will count as 12." "Of course," said Mrs. Bergmann, with equal dignity. "Then perhaps you will not mind signing the contract at once," said Mr. Satan, drawing from his pocket a typewritten page. Mrs. Bergmann walked to the writing table and took the paper from his hand. "Over the stamp, please," said Mr. Satan. "Must I sign it in blood?" asked Mrs. Bergmann, hesitatingly. "You can if you like," said Mr. Satan, "but I prefer red ink. It is quicker and more convenient." He handed her a stylograph pen. "Must it be witnessed?" she asked. "No," he replied. "These kinds of documents don't need a witness." In a firm, bold handwriting, Mrs. Bergmann signed her name in red ink across the 6-penny stamp. She half expected to hear a clap of thunder and to see Mr. Satan disappear, but nothing of the kind occurred. Mr. Satan took the document, folded it, placed it in his pocket-book, took up his hat and gloves, and said: "Mr. William Shakespeare will call to luncheon on Thursday week. At what hour is the luncheon to be?" 1:30, said Mrs. Bergmann. "He may be a few minutes late," answered Mr. Satan. "Good afternoon, madam," and he bowed and withdrew. Mrs. Bergmann chuckled to herself when she was alone. "I have done him," she thought to herself, "because 10,000,000 years in eternity is nothing. He might just as well have said 1 second as 10,000,000 years, since anything less than eternity in eternity is nothing. It is curious how stupid the devil is in spite of all his experience. Now I must think about my invitations." Part 2. The morning of Mrs. Bergmann's luncheon had arrived. She had asked 13 men and 9 women. But an hour before luncheon an incident happened which nearly drove Mrs. Bergmann distracted. One of her guests, who was also one of her most intimate friends, Mrs. Lockton, telephoned to her saying she had quite forgotten, but she had asked on that day a man to luncheon whom she did not know, and who had been sent to her by Walford, the famous professor. She ended the message by saying she would bring the stranger with her. "What is his name?" asked Mrs. Bergmann, not without intense irritation, meaning to put a veto on the suggestion. "His name is And at that moment the telephone communication was interrupted, and in spite of desperate efforts Mrs. Bergmann was unable to get on to Mrs. Lockton again. She reflected that it was quite useless for her to send a message saying that she had no room at her table, because Angela Lockton would probably bring the stranger all the same. Then she further reflected that in the excitement caused by the presence of Shakespeare it would not really much matter whether there was a stranger there or not. A little before 1:30 the guests began to arrive. Lord Pantry of Assouan, the famous soldier, was the first comer. He was soon followed by Professor Morgan, an authority on Greek literature, Mr. Peebles, the ex-Prime Minister, Mrs. Hubert Baldwin, the immensely popular novelist, the fascinating Mrs. Rupert Duncan, who was lending her genius to one of Ibsen's heroines at that moment, Miss Medea Tring, one of the latest American beauties, Corporal, the portrait painter, Richard Giles, critic and man of letters, Hereward Blenheim, a young and rising politician who before the age of 30 had already risen higher than most men of 60, Sir Horace Silvester, K.C.M.G., the brilliant financier, with his beautiful wife, Lady Irene, Professor Leo Newcastle, the eminent man of science, Lady Hyacinth Gloucester, and Mrs. Milden, who were well known for their beauty and charm. Osmond Hall, the paradoxical playwright, Monsieur Faubourg, the psychological novelist, Count Sciarra, an Italian nobleman about 50 years old, who had written a history of the popes, and who was now staying in London, Lady Herman, the beauty of a former generation, still extremely handsome, and Wilmot, the successful actor-manager. They were all assembled in the drawing-room upstairs, talking in knots and groups, and pervaded by a feeling of pleasurable excitement and expectation, so much so that conversation was intermittent, and nearly everybody was talking about the weather. The Right Honourable John Lockton, the eminent lawyer, was the last guest to arrive. "Angela will be here in a moment," he explained. "She asked me to come on first." Mrs. Bergmann grew restless. It was 1:30 and no Shakespeare. She tried to make her guests talk, with indifferent success. The expectation was too great. Everybody was absorbed by the thought of what was going to happen next. 10 minutes passed thus, and Mrs. Bergmann grew more and more anxious. At last the bell rang, and soon Mrs. Lockton walked upstairs, leading with her a quite insignificant, ordinary-looking, middle-aged, rather portly man, with shiny black hair, bald on the top of his head, and a blank, good-natured expression. "I'm so sorry to be so late, Louise dear," she said. "Let me introduce Mr. to you." And whether she had forgotten the name or not, Mrs. Bergmann did not know or care at the time, but it was mumbled in such a manner that it was impossible to catch it. Mrs. Bergmann shook hands with him absent-mindedly, and looking at the clock, saw that it was 10 minutes to 2. "I have been deceived," she thought to herself, and anger rose in her breast like a wave. At the same time she felt the one thing necessary was not to lose her head, or let anything damp the spirits of her guests. "We'll go down to luncheon directly," she said. "I'm expecting someone else, but he probably won't come till later." She led the way, and everybody trooped downstairs to the dining-room, feeling that disappointment was in store for them. Mrs. Bergmann left the place on her right vacant. She did not dare fill it up, because in her heart of hearts she felt certain Shakespeare would arrive, and she looked forward to a coup de theatre, which would be quite spoilt if his place was occupied. On her left sat Count Sciarra. The unknown friend of Angela Lockton sat at the end of the table next to Wilmot. The luncheon started haltingly. Angela Lockton's friend was heard saying in a clear voice that the dust in London was very trying. "Have you come from the country?" asked Monsieur Faubourg. "I myself am just returned from Oxford, where I once admired your admirable English lawns, vos pelouses séculaires." "Yes," said the stranger, "I only came up to town to-day, because it seems indeed a waste and a pity to spend the finest time of the year in London." Count Sciarra, who had not uttered a word since he had entered the house, turned to his hostess and asked her whom she considered after herself to be the most beautiful woman in the room, Lady Irene, Lady Hyacinth, or Mrs. Milden. "Mrs. Milden," he went on, "has the smile of La Gioconda, and hands and hair for Leonardo to paint. Lady Gloucester," he continued, leaving out the Christian name, "is English, like one of Shakespeare's women, Desdemona or Imogen, and Lady Irene has no nationality. She belongs to the dream worlds of Shelley and D'Annunzio. She is the guardian lady of Shelley's Sensitiva, the vision of the lily. Quel un vaso liturgico d'argento. And you, madame, you take away all my sense of criticism. Vous me troublez trop pour que je définisse votre genre débuté." Mrs. Milden was soon engaged in a deep tete-a-tete with Mr. Peebles, who was heard every now and then to say, "Quite, quite." Miss Tring was holding forth to Sylvester on French sculpture, and Sylvester now and again said, "Oh, really?" in the tone of intense interest which his friends knew indicated that he was being acutely bored. Lady Hyacinth was discussing socialism with Osmond Hall. Lady Herman was discussing the theory of evolution with Professor Newcastle. Mrs. Lockton, the question of the French Church with Faubourg, and Blenheim was discharging molten fragments of embryo exordiums and perorations on the subject of the stage to Wilmot. In fact, there was a general buzz of conversation. "Have you been to see Antony and Cleopatra?" asked Wilmot of the stranger. "Yes," said the neighbour. "I went last night. Many authors have treated the subject, and the version I saw last night was very pretty. I couldn't get a programme, so I didn't see who—" "I think my version," interrupted Wilmot with pride, "is admitted to be the best." "Ah, it is your version," said the stranger. "I beg your pardon. I think you treated the subject very well." "Yes," said Wilmot, "it is ungrateful material, but I think I made something fine of it." "No doubt, no doubt," said the stranger. "Do tell us," Mrs. Baldwin was heard to ask Monsieur Faubourg across the table, "what the young generation are doing in France. Who are the young novelists?" "There are no young novelists worth mentioning," answered Monsieur Faubourg. Miss Tring broke in and said she considered Le Visage Émerveillé by the Comtesse de Noailles to be the most beautiful book of the century, with the exception, perhaps, of the Tagebuch einer Verlorenen. But from the end of the table Blenheim's utterance was heard, preponderating over that of his neighbours. He was making a fine speech on the modern stage, comparing an actor-manager to Napoleon, and commenting on the campaigns of the latter in detail. Quite heedless of this, Mr. Wilmot was carrying on an equally impassioned but much slower monologue on his conception of the character of Cyrano de Bergerac, which he said he intended to produce. "Cyrano," he said, has been maligned by Coquelin. Coquelin is a great artist, but he did not understand Cyrano. Cyrano is a dreamer, a poet. He is a martyr of thought, like Tolstoy, a sacrifice to wasted, useless action, like Hamlet. He is a Molière come too soon, a Bayard come too late, a John the Baptist of the stage, calling out in vain in the wilderness of bricks and mortar. He is misunderstood, an enigma, an anachronism, a premature herald, a false dawn. Count Sciarra was engaged in a third monologue at the head of the table. He was talking at the same time to Mrs. Bergmann, Lady Irene, and Lady Hyacinth about the devil. "Ah, que j'aime le diable," he was saying in low, tender tones. "The devil who creates your beauty to lure us to destruction, the devil who put honey into the voice of the siren, the dolce serena. Che immarinare in mezzo il mar dismaga." And he hummed this line in a sing-song 2 or 3 times over. The devil who makes us dream and doubt, and who made life interesting by persuading Eve to eat the silver apple. What would life have been if she had not eaten the apple? We should all be in the silly trees of the Garden of Eden, and I should be sitting next to you, he said to Mrs. Bergmann, without knowing that you were beautiful, que vous étiez belle et que vous étiez désirable, que vous étiez poussante et câline, que j'ai fait naufrage dans une mer d'amour, et il naufragio me dolce in questo mare, en un mot que je vous aimé. "Life outside the Garden of Eden has many drawbacks," said Mrs. Bergmann, who, although she was inwardly pleased by Count Sciarra's remarks, saw by Lady Irene's expression that she thought he was mad. "Aucun drawback," answered Sciarra. "N'égalerait celui de contempler les divines contours féminines sans un frisson. Pensez donc si, Madame Bergmann." "Count Sciarra," interrupted Mrs. Bergmann, terrified of what was coming next, "do tell me about the book you are writing on Venice." Mrs. Lockton was at that moment discussing portraiture in novels with Monsieur Faubourg, and during a pause Miss Tring was heard to make the following remark. "And is it true, Monsieur Faubourg, that Cécile, in La Mauvaise Bonté, is a portrait of someone you once loved, and who treated you very badly?" Monsieur Faubourg, a little embarrassed, said that a creative artist made a character out of many originals. Then, seeing that nobody was saying a word to his neighbour, he turned round and asked him if he had been to the Academy. "Yes," answered the stranger. "It gets worse every year, doesn't it?" "But Mr. Corporal's pictures are always worth seeing," said Faubourg. "I think he paints men better than women," said the stranger. "He doesn't flatter people, but of course his pictures are very clever." At this moment the attention of the whole table was monopolized by Osmond Hall, who began to discuss the scenario of a new play he was writing. "My play," he began, "is going to be called The King of the North Pole. I have never been to the North Pole, and I don't mean to go there. It's not necessary to have first-hand knowledge of technical subjects in order to write a play. People say that Shakespeare must have studied law because his allusions to the law are frequent and accurate. That does not prove that he knew law any more than the fact that he put a sea in Bohemia proves that he did not know geography. It proves he was a dramatist. He wanted a sea in Bohemia, he wanted lawyer's shop. I should do just the same thing myself. I wrote a play about doctors, knowing nothing about medicine. I asked a friend to give me the necessary information. Shakespeare, I expect, asked his friends to give him the legal information he required." Every allusion to Shakespeare was a stab to Mrs. Bergmann. "Shakespeare's knowledge of the law is very thorough," broke in Lockton. "Not so thorough as the knowledge of medicine which is revealed in my play," said Hall. "Shakespeare knew law by intuition," murmured Wilmot, "but he did not guess what the modern stage would make of his plays." "Let us hope not," said Giles. "Shakespeare," said Faubourg, "was a psychologue. He had the power, I cannot say it in English, de deviner ce qu'il ne savait pas en poussant dans le fond et les tréfonds de son âme." "Gammon!" said Hall. "He had the power of asking his friends for the information he required." "Do you really think," asked Giles, "that before he wrote 'Time delves the parallel on beauty's brow,' he consulted his lawyer as to a legal metaphor suitable for a sonnet?" "And do you think," asked Mrs. Duncan, "that he asked his female relations what it would feel like to be jealous of Octavia if one happened to be Cleopatra?" "Shakespeare was a married man," said Hall, "and if his wife found the manuscripts of his sonnets lying about he must have known a jealous woman." "Shakespeare evidently didn't trouble his friends for information on natural history, not for a playwright," said Hall. "I myself should not mind what liberty I took with the cuckoo, the bee, or even the basilisk. I should not trouble you for accurate information on the subject. I should not even mind saying the cuckoo lays eggs in its own nest, if it suited the dramatic situation." The whole of this conversation was torture to Mrs. Bergmann. "Shakespeare," said Lady Hyacinth, "had a universal nature. One can't help thinking he was almost like God." "That's what people will say of me 100 years hence," said Hall. "Only it is to be hoped they'll leave out the 'almost.'" "Shakespeare understood love," said Lady Herman in a loud voice. "He knew how a man makes love to a woman. If Richard III had made love to me as Shakespeare describes him doing it, I'm not sure I could have resisted him. But the finest of all Shakespeare's men is Othello. That's a real man. Desdemona was a fool. It's not wonderful that Othello didn't see through Iago, but Desdemona ought to have seen through him. The stupidest woman can see through a clever man like him. But, of course, Othello was a fool too." "Yes," broke in Mrs. Lockton, "if Napoleon had married Desdemona he would have made Iago marry one of his sisters." "I think Desdemona is the most pathetic of Shakespeare's heroines," said Lady Hyacinth. "Don't you think so, Mr. Hall?" "It's easy enough to make a figure pathetic who is strangled by a nigger," answered Hall. "Now, if Desdemona had been a negress, Shakespeare would have started fair." "If Shakespeare had lived now he would have written novels," said Faubourg. "Yes," said Mrs. Baldwin, "I feel sure you are right there." "If Shakespeare had lived now," said Sciarra to Mrs. Bergmann, "we shouldn't notice his existence. He would be just un monsieur comme tout le monde, like that monsieur sitting next to Faubourg," he added in a low voice. "The problem about Shakespeare," broke in Hall, "is not how he wrote his plays. I could teach a poodle to do that in half an hour. But the problem is, what made him leave off writing just when he was beginning to know how to do it? It is as if I had left off writing plays 10 years ago." "Perhaps," said the stranger, hesitatingly and modestly, "he had made enough money by writing plays to retire on his earnings and live in the country." Nobody took any notice of this remark. "If Bacon was really the playwright," said Lockton, "the problem is a very different one." "If Bacon had written Shakespeare's plays," said Silvester, "they wouldn't have been so bad." "There seems to me to be only one argument," said Professor Morgan, "in favour of the Bacon theory, and that is that the range of mind displayed in Shakespeare's plays is so great that it would have been child's play for the man who wrote Shakespeare's plays to have written the works of Bacon." "Yes," said Hall, "but because it would be child's play for the man who wrote my plays to have written your works and those of Professor Newcastle, which it would, it doesn't prove that you wrote my plays." Bacon was a philosopher, said Wilmot, and Shakespeare was a poet, a dramatic poet, but Shakespeare was also an actor-manager, and only an actor-manager could have written the plays. What do you think of the Bacon theory? Asked Faubourg of the stranger. I think, said the stranger, that we shall soon have to say eggs and Shakespeare instead of eggs and bacon. This remark caused a slight shudder to pass through all the guests, and Mrs. Bergmann felt sorry that she had not taken decisive measures to prevent the stranger's intrusion. Shakespeare wrote his own plays, said Sciarra, and I don't know if he knew law, but he knew le coeur de la femme. Cleopatra bids her slave find out the colour of Octavia's hair. That is just what my wife, my Angelica, would do if I were to marry someone in London while she was at Rome. Mr. Gladstone used to say, broke in Lockton, that Dante was inferior to Shakespeare because he was too great an optimist. Dante was not an optimist, said Sciarra, about the future life of politicians, but I think they were both of them pessimists about man and both optimists about God. Shakespeare, began Blenheim, but he was interrupted by Mrs. Duncan, who cried out, I wish he were alive now, and would write me a part, a real woman's part. The women have so little to do in Shakespeare's plays. There's Juliet, but one can't play Juliet till one's 40, and then one's too old to look 14. There's Lady Macbeth, but she's got nothing to do except walk in her sleep and say, out, damn spot. They were not actresses in his days, and of course it was no use writing a woman's part for a boy. You should have been born in France, said Faubourg. Race scenes, women are created for you to play. Oh, you've got Sarah, said Mrs. Duncan. You don't want anyone else. I think Racine's boring, said Mrs. Lockton. He's so artificial. Oh, don't say that, said Giles. Racine is the most exquisite of poets, so sensitive, so acute, and so harmonious. I like Rostand better, said Mrs. Lockton. Rostand! Exclaimed Miss Tring in disgust. He writes such bad verses. Du caoutchouc, he's so vulgar. It is true, said Wilmot. He's an amateur. He has never written professionally for his bread, but only for his pleasure. But in that sense, said Giles, God is an amateur. I confess, said Peebles, that I cannot appreciate French poetry. I can read Rousseau with pleasure and Bossuet, but I cannot admire Corneille and Racine. Everybody writes plays now, said Faubourg with a sigh. I have never written a play, said Lord Pantry. Nor I, said Lockton. But nearly everyone at this table has, said Faubourg. Mrs. Baldwin has written Matilda. Mr. Giles has written a tragedy called Queen Swaflod. I wrote a play in my youth, my Menentrier de Parma. I'm sure Corporal has written a play. Count Sciarra must have written several. Have you ever written a play? He said, turning to his neighbour, the stranger. Yes, answered the stranger. I once wrote a play called Hamlet. You were courageous with such an original before you, said Faubourg severely. Yes, said the stranger. The original was very good, but I think, he added modestly, that I improved upon it. Encore une fois sur des paradoxes, murmured Faubourg to himself in disgust. In the meantime, Wilmot was giving Professor Morgan the benefit of his views on Greek art, punctuated with allusions to tariff reform and devolution for the benefit of Blenheim. Luncheon was over, and cigarettes were lighted. Mrs. Bergmann had quite made up her mind that she had been cheated, and there was only one thing for which she consoled herself, and that was that she had not waited for luncheon, but had gone down immediately, since so far all her guests had kept up a continuous stream of conversation, which had every now and then become general, though they still every now and then glanced at the empty chair and wondered what the coming attraction was going to be. Mrs. Milden had carried on two almost interrupted tete-a-tetes, first with one of her neighbours, then with the other. In fact, everybody had talked, except the stranger, who had hardly spoken, and since Faubourg had turned away from him in disgust, nobody had taken any further notice of him. Mrs. Baldwin, remarking this, good-naturedly leant across the table and asked him if he had come to London for the Wagner cycle. "No," he answered. "I came for the horse show at Olympia." At this moment Count Sciarra, having finished his third cigarette, turned to his hostess and thanked her for having allowed him to meet the most beautiful women of London in the most beautiful house in London, and in the house of the most beautiful hostess in London. "J'ai vu chez vous," he said, "les lys argent et la rose blanche, mais vous étiez la rose écarlate, la rose de mort dont les parfums vivent dans mon cœur comme un poisson doré." And here he hummed in a sing-song, "Io son contava, io son dolce serena, addio dolce serena." Then he suddenly and abruptly got up, kissed his hostess's hand vehemently 3 times, and said he was very sorry, but he must hasten to keep a pressing engagement. He then left the room. Mrs. Bergmann got up and said, "Let us go upstairs." But the men had most of them to go, some to the House of Commons, others to fulfil various engagements. The stranger thanked Mrs. Bergmann for her kind hospitality and left, and the remaining guests, seeing that it was obvious that no further attraction was to be expected, now took their leave reluctantly and went, feeling that they had been cheated. Angela Lockton stayed a moment. "Who were you expecting, Louise dear?" she asked. "Only an old friend," said Mrs. Bergmann, "whom you would all have been very glad to see. Only, as he doesn't want anybody to know he's in London, I couldn't tell you all who he was." "But tell me now," said Mrs. Lockton. "You know how discreet I am." "I promised not to, dearest Angela," she answered. "And, by the way, what was the name of the man you brought with you?" "Didn't I tell you? How stupid of me," said Mrs. Lockton. "It's a very easy name to remember. Shakespeare. William Shakespeare." End of section 7.
Section 8 of Orpheus in Mayfair Stories by Maurice Baring. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Section 8 Fête Galante to Cecilia Fisher. "The King said that nobody had ever danced as I danced tonight," said Columbine. "He said it was more than dancing. It was magic." "It is true," said Harlequin. "You never danced like that before." But Pierrot paid no heed to their remarks, and stared vacantly at the sky. They were sitting on the deserted stage of the grass amphitheatre where they had been playing. Behind them were the clumps of cypress trees which framed a vista of endless wooden garden, and formed their drop scene. They were sitting immediately beneath the wooden framework made of 2 upright beams and 1 horizontal, which formed the primitive proscenium, and from which little colored lights had hung during the performance. The King and Queen and their lords and ladies, who had looked on at the living puppet show, had all left the amphitheatre. They had put on their masks and their dominoes, and were now dancing on the lawns, whispering in the alleys and the avenues, or sitting in groups under the tall dark trees. Some of them were in boats on the lake, and everywhere one went from the dark boscages came sounds of music, thin, tinkling tunes played on guitars by skilled hands, and the bird-like twittering and whistling of flageolets. "The King said I looked like a moon fairy," said Columbine to Pierrot. Pierrot only stared in the sky and laughed inanely. "If you persist in slighting me like this," she whispered in his ear, in a whisper which was like a hiss, "I will abandon you for ever. I will give my heart to Harlequin, and you shall never see me again." But Pierrot continued to stare at the sky, and laughed once more insanely. Then Columbine got up, her eyes flashing with rage. Taking Harlequin by the arm, she dragged him swiftly away. They danced across the grass semicircle of the amphitheatre and up the steps away into the alleys. Pierrot was left alone with Pantaloon, who was asleep, for he was old and clowning fatigued him. Then Pierrot left the amphitheatre also, and putting a black mask on his face, he joined the revellers who were everywhere dancing, whispering, talking, and making music in subdued tones. He sought out a long, lonely avenue, in one side of which there nestled, almost entirely concealed by bushes and undergrowth, a round, open Greek temple. Right at the end of the avenue a foaming waterfall splashed down into a large marble basin, from which a tall fountain rose, white and ghostly, and made a sobbing noise. Pierrot went towards the temple, then he turned back and walked right into the undergrowth through the bushes, and lay down on the grass and listened to the singing of the nightjar. The whole garden that night seemed to be sighing and whispering. There was a soft warm wind, and a smell of mown hay in the air, and an intoxicating sweetness came from the bushes of syringa. Columbine and Harlequin also joined the revellers. They passed from group to group, with aimless curiosity, pausing sometimes by the artificial ponds and sometimes by the dainty groups of dancers, whose satin and whose pearls glimmered faintly in the shifting moonlight, for the night was cloudy. At last they, too, were tired of the revel. They wandered towards a more secluded place and made for the avenue which Pierrot had sought. On their way they passed through a narrow grass walk between two rows of closely cropped yew hedges. There, on a marble seat, a tall man in a black domino was sitting, his head resting on his hands, and between the loose folds of his satin cloak one caught the glint of precious stones. When they had passed him, Columbine whispered to Harlequin, "That is the king. I caught sight of his jewelled collar." They presently found themselves in the long avenue at the end of which were the waterfall and the fountain. They wandered on till they reached the Greek temple, and there suddenly Columbine put her finger on her lips. Then she led Harlequin back a little way and took him round through the undergrowth to the back of the temple, and, crouching down in the bushes, bade him look. In the middle of the temple there was a statue of Eros holding a torch in his hands. Standing close beside the statue were two figures, a man dressed as a Pierrot, and a beautiful lady who wore a grey satin domino. She had taken off her mask and pushed back the hood from her hair, which was encircled by a diadem made of something shining and silvery, and a ray of moonlight fell on her face, which was as delicate as the petal of a flower. Pierrot was masked. He was holding her hand and looking into her eyes, which were turned upwards towards his. "It is the Queen," whispered Columbine to Harlequin, and once more putting her finger on her lips, she deftly led him by the hand and noiselessly threaded her way through the bushes and back into the avenue, and without saying a word ran swiftly with him to the place where they had seen the king. He was still there, alone, his head resting upon his hands. In the temple the Queen was upbraiding her lover for his temerity in having crossed the frontier into the land from which he had been banished forever, and for having dared to appear at the court revel disguised as Pierrot. "Remember," she was saying, "the enemies that surround us, the dreadful peril, and the doom that awaits us." And her lover said, "What is doom, and what is death? You whispered to the night, and I heard. You sighed, and I am here." He tore the mask from his face, and the Queen looked at him and smiled. At that moment a rustle was heard in the undergrowth, and the Queen started back from him, whispering, "We are betrayed! Fly!" And her lover put on his mask and darted through the undergrowth, following a path which he and no one else knew, till he came to an open space where his squire awaited him with horses, and they galloped away safe from all pursuit. Then the king walked into the temple and led the queen back to the palace without saying a word. But the whole avenue was full of dark men bearing torches and armed with swords, who were searching the undergrowth. And presently they found Pierrot, who, ignorant of all that had happened, had been listening all night to the song of the nightjar. He was dragged to the palace and cast into a dungeon, and the king was told. But the revel did not cease, and the dancing and the music continued softly as before. The king sent for Columbine and told her she should have speech with Pierrot in his prison, for haply he might have something to confess to her. And Columbine was taken to Pierrot's dungeon, and the king followed her without her knowing it, and concealed himself behind the door, which he set ajar. Columbine upbraided Pierrot and said, "All this was my work. I have always known that you loved the queen, and yet for the sake of past days tell me the truth. Was it love or a joke, such as those you love to play?" Pierrot laughed inanely. "It was a joke," he said. "It is my trade to make jokes. What else can I do?" "You loved the queen nevertheless," said Columbine. "Of that I am sure, and for that I have had my revenge." "It was a joke," said Pierrot, and he laughed again. And though she talked and raved and wept, she could get no other answer from him. Then she left him, and the king entered the dungeon. "I have heard what you said," said the king, "but to me you must tell the truth. I do not believe it was you who met the queen in the temple. Tell me the truth, and your life shall be spared." "It was a joke," said Pierrot, and he laughed. Then the king grew fierce and stormed and threatened, but his rage and threats were in vain, for Pierrot only laughed. Then the king appealed to him as man to man and implored him to tell him the truth, for he would have given his kingdom to believe that it was the real Pierrot who had met the queen and that the adventure had been a joke. Pierrot only repeated what he had said, and laughed and giggled inanely. At dawn the prison door was opened, and the three masked men led Pierrot out through the courtyard into the garden. The revellers had gone home, but here and there lights still twinkled and flickered, and a stray note or two of music was still heard. Some of the latest of the revellers were going home. The dawn was grey and chilly. They led Pierrot through the alleys to the grass amphitheatre, and they hanged him on the horizontal beam which formed part of the primitive proscenium where he and Columbine had danced so wildly in the night. They hanged him, and his white figure dangled from the beam as though he were still dancing. And the new Pierrot, who was appointed the next day, was told that such would be the fate of all mummers who went too far, and whose jokes and pranks overstepped the limits of decency and good breeding. End of Section 8. Section 9 of Orpheus in Mayfair Stories by Maurice Baring. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Section 9. The Garland. The referendarius had 3 junior clerks to carry on the business of his department, and they in their turn were assisted by 2 scribes, who did most of the copying and kept the records. The work of the department consisted in filing and annotating the petitions and cases which were referred from the lower courts through the channel of the referendarius to the emperor. The 3 clerks and their 2 scribes occupied a high marble room in the spacious office. It was as yet early in April, but, nevertheless, the sun out of doors was almost fierce. The high marble rooms of the office were cool and stuffy at the same time, and the spring sunshine without, the soft breeze from the sea, the call of the flower sellers in the street, and the lazy murmur of the town had, in these shaded, musty, and parchment-smelling halls, diffused an atmosphere of laziness which inspired the clerks in question with an overwhelming desire to do nothing. There was, indeed, no pressing work on hand. Only from time to time the referendarius, who occupied a room to himself next door to theirs, would communicate with them through a hole in the wall, demanding information on some point or asking to be supplied with certain documents. Then the clerks would make a momentary pretense of being busy, and ultimately the scribes would find either the documents or the information which were required. As it was, the clerks were all of them engaged in occupations which were remote from official work. The eldest of them, Cephalus by name, a man who was distinguished from the others by a certain refined sobriety, both in his dark dress and in his quiet demeanor, was reading a treatise on algebra. The second, Theophilus, a musician, whose tunic was as bright as his flaming hair, was mending a small organ. And the third, Rufinus, a rather pale, short-sighted, and untidy youth, was scribbling on a tablet. The scribes were busy sorting old records and putting them away in their permanent places. Presently an official strolled in from another department. He was a middle-aged, corpulent, and cheerful-looking man, dressed in gaudy colored tissue, on which all manner of strange birds were depicted. He was bursting with news. "Phocas is going to win," he said. "It is certain." Cephalus looked vaguely up from his book and said, "Oh!" Theophilus and Rufinus paid no attention to the remark. "Well," continued the newcomer cheerfully, "who will come to the races with me?" As soon as he heard the word races, Rufinus looked up from his scribbling. "I will come," he said, "if I can get leave." "I did not know you cared for that sort of thing," said Cephalus. Rufinus blushed and murmured something about going every now and then. He walked out of the room and sought the referendarius in the next room. This official was reading a document. He did not look up when Rufinus entered, but went on with his reading. At last, after a prolonged interval, he turned round and said, "What is it?" "May I go to the races?" asked Rufinus. "Well," said the high official. "What about your work?" "We've finished everything," said the clerk. The head of the department assumed an air of mystery, and coughed. "I don't think I can very well see my way to letting you go," he said. "I am very sorry," he added quickly. "And if it depended on me, you should go at once. But he added, he always alluded to the head of the office as he, "does not like it. He may come in at any moment and find you gone. No, I'm afraid I can't let you go today. Now, if it had been yesterday, you could have gone." "I should only be away an hour," said Rufinus, tentatively. "He might choose just that hour to come round. If it depended only on me, you should go at once." And he laughed and slapped Rufinus on the back, jocularly. The clerk did not press the point further. "You'd better get on with that index," said the high official as Rufinus withdrew. He told the result of his interview to his sporting friend, who started out by himself to the hippodrome. Rufinus settled down to his index, but he soon fell into a mood of abstraction. The races and the games did not interest him in the least. It was something else which attracted him. And as he sat musing, the vision of the hippodrome as he had last seen it rose clearly before him. He saw the seaweed colored marble, the glistening porticos, adorned with the masterpieces of Greece, crowded with women in gemmed embroideries and men in white tunics hemmed with broad purple. He saw the generals with their barbaric officers, Bulgarians, Persians, Arabs, Slavs, the long line of savage-looking prisoners in their chains, and the golden breastplates of the standard-bearers. He saw the immense silk vellum floating in the azure air over that rippling sea of men, those hundreds of thousands who swarmed on the marble steps of the hippodrome. He saw the emperor in his high-pillared box on his circular throne of dull gold, surrounded by slaves fanning him with jewel-colored plumes, and fenced round with golden swords. And opposite him, on the other side of the stadium, the empress, mantled in a stiff pontifical robe, laden with heavy embroidered stuffs, her little head framed like a portrait in a square crown of gold and diamonds, whence chains of emeralds hung down to her breast, motionless as an idol, impassive as a gilded mummy. He saw the crowd of gorgeous women, grouped like Eastern flowers around her. He saw one woman. He saw one form as fresh as a lily of the valley, all white amidst that hard metallic splendor, frail as a dewy anemone, slender as the moist narcissus. He saw one face like the chalice of a rose, and amidst all those fiery jewels two large eyes as soft as dark violets. And the sumptuous court, the plumes, the swords, the standards, the hot vari-colored crowd melted away and disappeared, so that when the emperor rose and made the sign of the cross over his people, first to the right and then to the left, and thirdly over the half circle behind him, and the singers of Saint Sophia and the Church of the Holy Apostles mingled their bass chant with the shrill trebles of the chorus of the hippodrome to the sound of silver organs, he thought that the great hymn of praise was rising to her and to her alone, and that men had come from the uttermost parts of the earth to pay homage to her, to sing her praise, to kneel to her, the wondrous, the very beautiful, peerless, radiant, perfect. A voice, followed by a cough, called from the hole in the wall, but Rufinus paid no heed, so deeply sunk was he in his vision. "Rufinus, the chief is calling you," said Cephalus. Rufinus started and hurried to the hole in the wall. The head of the department gave him a message for an official in another department. Rufinus hurried with the message downstairs and delivered it. On his way back he passed the main portico on the ground floor. He walked out into the street. It was empty. Everybody was at the games. A dark-skinned country girl passed him singing a song about the swallow and the spring. She was bearing a basket full of anemones, violets, narcissi, wild roses, and lilies of the valley. "Will you sell me your flowers?" he asked, and he held out a silver coin. "You are welcome to them," said the girl. "I do not need your money." He took the flowers and returned to the room upstairs. The flowers filled the stuffy place with an unwonted and wonderful fragrance. Then he sat down and appeared to be once more busily engrossed in his index. But side by side with the index he had a small tablet, and on this, every now and then, he added or erased a word to a short poem. The sense of it was something like this: "Rhodocleia, flowers of spring, I have woven in a ring. Take this wreath, my offering, Rhodocleia. Here's the lily, here's the rose, her full chalice shall disclose. Here's narcissus, wet with dew, windflower, and the violet blue. Wear the garland I have made, crowned with it, put pride away, for the wreath that blooms must fade. Thou thyself must fade some day, Rhodocleia." End of Section 9.
Section 10 of Orpheus and Mayfair and Other Stories and Sketches. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nemo. Orpheus and Mayfair and Other Stories and Sketches by Maurice Baring. The Spider's Web. To K.L. He heard the bell of the Badia sound hour after hour, and still sleep refused its solace. He got up and looked through the narrow window. The sky in the east was soft with a luminous intensity, as of a melted sapphire, that comes just before the dawn. One large star was shining next to the paling moon. He watched the sky as it grew more and more transparent, and a fresh breeze blew from the hills. It was the second night that he had spent without sleeping, but the weariness of his body was as nothing compared with the aching emptiness which possessed his spirit. Only 3 days ago the world had seemed to him starred and gemmed like the celestial city, an enchanted kingdom, waiting like a sleeping princess for the kiss of the adventurous conqueror. And now the colors had faded. The dream had vanished. The sun seemed to be deprived of his glory, and the summer had lost its sweetness. His eye fell upon some papers which were lying loose upon his table. There was an unfinished sonnet which he had begun 3 days ago. The octet was finished, and the first 2 lines of the sestet. He would never finish it now. It had no longer any reason to be, for it was a cry to ears which were now deaf, a question, an appeal, which demanded an answering smile, a consenting echo, and the lips, the only lips which could frame that answer, were dumb. He remembered that Casella, the musician, had asked him a week ago for the text of a canzone which he had repeated to him one day. He had promised to let him have it. The promise had entirely gone out of his mind. Then he reflected that because the ship of his hopes and dreams had been wrecked, there was no reason why he should neglect his obligations to his fellow travellers on the uncertain sea. He sat down and transcribed by the light of the dawn, in his exquisite handwriting, the stanzas which had been the fruit of a brighter day. And the memory of this dead joy was exceedingly bitter to him, so that he sat musing for some time on the unutterable sadness which the ghost of perished joys bring to man in his misery. And a line of Virgil buzzed in his brain, but not, as of yore, did it afford him the luxury of causeless melancholy, but like a cruel finger it touched his open wound. The ancients, he thought, knew how to bear misfortune. Livius vit potentia, quid corriagere est nefas. As the words occurred to him, he thought how much better equipped he was for the bitter trial, since had he not the certain hope of another life, and of meeting his beloved in the spaces of endless felicity? Surely then he should be able to bear his sorrow with as great a fortitude as the pagan poets, who look forward to nothing but the dust, to whom the fabled dim country beyond the Styx was a cheerless dream, and to whom a living dog upon the earth was more worthy of envy than the king of all Elysium. He must learn of the ancients. The magic of the lemon-colored dawn had vanished now before the swift daylight. Many bells were ringing in the city, and the first signs of life were stirring in the streets. He searched for a little book, and read of the consolation which Cicero gave to Lelius in the De Amicitia. But he had not read many lines before he closed the book. His wound was too fresh for the balm of reason and philosophy. Later, he thought, this will strengthen and help me, but not today. Today my wound must bleed, and be allowed to bleed, for all the philosophy in the world cannot lessen the fact that yesterday she was, and today she is not. He felt a desire to escape from his room, which had been the chapel of such holy prayers, the shrine where so many fervent tapers of hope had burnt, where so sweet an incense of dream had risen. He left his room and hurried down the narrow stone stairs into the street. As he left the house, he turned to his right and walked on till he reached O San Michele. There he turned to his right again and walked straight on till he reached the churches of Santa Riparata and San Giovanni. He entered San Giovanni and said a brief prayer. Then he took the nearest street, east of Santa Riparata, to the Porta a Ballo, and found himself beyond the walls of the city. He walked towards Fiesole. The glory of the sunrise was still in the sky, the fragrance of the dawning summer, it was the 11th of June, was in the air. He walked towards the east. The corn on the hills was green, and pink wild roses fringed every plot of wheat. The grass was wet with dew. The city glittered in the plain beneath, clean and fresh in the dazzling air. It seemed a part of the pageant of summer, an unreal piece of imagery, distinct and clear-cut, yet miraculous, like a mirage seen in mid-ocean. Truly, he thought, this is the city of the flower, and the lily is its fitting emblem. But while his heart went out towards his native town, he felt a sharp pang as he remembered that the flower of flowers, the queen of the lilies, had been mowed down by the scythe, and the city which to him had heretofore been an altar was now a tomb. The lovely Virgilian dirge. Manibus date lille plenis, his saltem cumulem donis et fungerenani, munere, rang in his ears, and he thought that he too must bring a gift and scatter lilies on her grave, handfuls of lilies, but they must be unfading flowers, wet with immortal tears. He pondered on this gift. It must be a gift of song, a temple built in verse, but he was still unsatisfied. No dirge, however tender and solemn, no elegy, however soft and majestic, no song, however piteous, could be a sufficient offering for the glorious being who had died in her youth and beauty. But what could he fashion or build? He thought with envy of Arnolfo and of Giotto. The one with his bricks could have built a tomb which would prove to be one of the wonders of the world, and the other with his brush could have fixed her features forever, for the wonder of future generations. And yet was not his instrument the most potent of all, his vehicle the most enduring? Stones decayed and colors faded, but verse remained, outliving bronze and marble. Yes, his monument should be more lasting than all the masterpieces of Giotto, than all the proud designs of Arnolfo. But how should it be? He had reached a narrow lane at the foot of a steep hill, covered with corn and dotted with olives. He lay down under a hedge in the shade. The sun was shining on two large bramble bushes which grew on the hedge opposite him. Above him, on his right, was a tall cypress tree standing by itself, and the corn plots stretched up behind him till they reached the rocky summits tufted with firs. Between the two bramble bushes a spider had spun a large web, and he was sitting in the midst of it, awaiting his prey. But the bramble and the web were still wet with the morning dew, whose little drops glistened in the sunshine like diamonds. Every tiny thread and filament of the web was dewy and lit by the newly awakened sun. He lay on his back in the shade and pondered on the shape and nature of his gift of song, and on the deathless flowers that he must grow and gather and lay upon her tomb. The spider's web caught his eye, and from where he lay the sight was marvellous. The spider seemed like a small globe of fire in the midst of a number of concentric silvery lines studded with dewy gems. It was like a miniature sun in the midst of a system of gleaming stars. The delicate web, with its shining films and dewdrops, seemed to him as he lay there to be a vision of the whole universe, with all its worlds and stars revolving around the central orb of light. It was as though a veil had been torn away, and he were looking on the naked glory of the spheres, the heart of heaven, the very home of God. He looked and looked, his whole spirit filled with ineffable awe and breathless humility. He lay gazing on the chance miracle of nature till a passing cloud obscured the sun, and the spider's web wore once more its ordinary appearance. Then he arose with tears in his eyes, and gave a great sigh of thankfulness. I have found it, he thought. I will say of her what has never yet been said of any woman. I will paint all hell, all purgatory, and all that is in them, to make more glorious the glory of her abode. And I will reveal to man that glory. I will show her in the circle of spotless flame, among the rivers and rings of eternal light, which revolve around the inmost heart, the fiery rose, and move obedient to the love which moves the sun. And his thought shaped itself into verse, and he murmured to himself, L'amor che muove il sole l'altre stelle. End of section 10.
Section 11 of Orpheus in Mayfair and Other Stories and Sketches. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Orpheus in Mayfair and Other Stories and Sketches by Maurice Baring. Section 11. Edward II at Berkeley Castle by an Eyewitness, with apologies to Mr. H. Belloc. The king had not slept for 3 nights. He looked at his face in the muddy pool of water, which had settled in the worn flagstones of his prison floor, and noticed that his beard was of a week's growth. Beads of sweat stood on his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot. In the room next door, which was the canteen, the soldiers were playing on a drum. Over the tall hills the dawn was ruffling the clouds. There was a faint glimmer on the waters of the river. The footsteps of the jailers were heard on the outer rampart. At 7 o'clock they brought the king a good dinner. They allowed him Burgundy from France, and yellow mead, and white bread baked in the ovens of the abbey, although he was constrained to drink out of pewter, and plates were forbidden him. Eustace, his page, timidly offered him music. The king bade him sing the lay of the Sussex lass, which begins thus: Triumphant, oh, triumphant now she stands, Above my Sussex and above my sea. She stretches out her thin ulterior hands Across the morning. But the king, to whom memories were portentous, called for another song, and Eustace sang a stave of that ballad which was made on the Pyrenees, and which is still unfinished, for the modern world has no need of these things, telling of how Lord Raymond drank in a little tent with Charlemagne. Enormous through the morning the tall battalions run. The men who fought with Charlemagne are very dearly done. The wine is dark beneath the night, the stars are in the sky. The hammer's in the blacksmith's hand in case he wants to try. We'll ride to Fontarabia, we'll storm the stubborn wall. And I call. And Uriel and his seraphim are hammering a shield, and twice along the valley has the horn of Roland pealed, and Cleopatra on the Nile is salt in Brittany, and Lancelot in Camelot, and Drake upon the sea, and behind the young Republic are the fellows with the flag, and I brag. The king listlessly opened his eyes and said that he had no stomach for such song, and from the next door came the mutter of the drums. For on that night, which was Candlemas, Thursday, or, as we should now call it, Friday, the jailers were keeping holiday, and drinking English beer brewed in Sussex, for the beer of West England was not to their liking, as any one who has walked down the old Roman road through Daglingworth, Brimsfield, and Birdlip towards Cardigan on a warm summer's day can know. For a man may tramp that road and stop and ask for drink at an inn, and receive nothing but imperialist whiskey and drinks that annoy rather than satisfy the great thirst of a Christian. Outside, a little breeze had crept out of the west. The morning star was paling over the Quantock Hills, and the king was mortally weary. This day, 3 years ago, he thought, I was spurred and harnessed for the lists in a tunic of mail, with an emerald on my shoulder strap, and I was tilting with my lord of Clermont before Queen Isabella of France. The birds were singing in Touraine, and the sun was beating on the lists, and the minstrels of Val es Dunes were chanting the song of the men who died for the faith when they stormed Jerusalem. "What is the lilt of that song," said the king, "which the singers of Val es Dunes sang?" And Eustace pondered, for his memory was weak and he was overwrought by nights of watching and days of vigilance. But presently he touched his strings and sang: "The captains came from Normandy in clamorous ships across the sea, and from the trees in Gascony the masts were cloven tall and free, and Turpin swung the helm and sang, and stars like all the bells at Brie from cloudy steeples rang. The rotten leaves are whirling down, dishevelled from September's crown, the emperors have left the town, the Weald of Sussex, burnt and brown, is trampled by the kings, and Harmuth gallops up the down, and as he rides he sings. He sings of battles and of wine, of boats that leap the bellowing brine, of April eyes that smile and shine, of Raymond and Lord Catiline, and Carthage by the sea, of saints and of the Muses nine that dwell in Gascony." And to the king, as he heard this stave, came visions of his youth, of how he had galloped from Woodstock to Stonesfield on a night of June within 11 hours, with a company of minstrels, and of how, during that long feast at Arundel, he made a song in the vernacular in praise of Saint Anselm. And he remembered that he owed a candle to that saint, for he had vowed that if the wife of Westermain should meet him after the tournament, he would burn a tall candle at Canterbury before Michaelmas. But this had escaped his mind, for it had been tossed hither and thither during days of conflict which had come later, and he was not loth to believe that the neglect of this service and the idle vow had been cornerstone of his misfortunes, and had helped to bring about his miserable plight. While these threads of memory glimmered in his mind, the small tallow rushlight which lit the dungeon flickered and went out. The chapel clock struck 6. The king made a gesture which meant that the time of music was over, and Eustace went back to the canteen, where the men of the guard were playing at dice by the light of smoky rushlights. The king lay down on his wooden pallet, whose linen was delicate and of lawn, embroidered with his own cipher and crown. The pillow, which was stuffed with scented rushes, was delicious to the cheek, and yielding. All that night in London, Queen Isabella had been waiting for the news from France. A storm was blowing across the Channel, and the ships, their pilots were Germans, and bungled in reading the stars, making for the port, turned back towards Dunkirk. It was a storm such as, if you are in a small boat, turns you back from Broughty Ferry to the Goodwin Sands. The Queen, who took counsel of no one, was in two minds as to her daring deed, and her hostage trembled in an uncertain grasp. In Saxony, the banished favourites talked wildly, cursing the councils of London. But Saxony was heedless and unmoved, and Piers Gaveston spoke heated words in vain. The king, who was in that lethargic state of slumber between sleep and waking, heard a shuffle of steps beyond the door. A cold sweat broke once more on his forehead, and he waved his left hand listlessly. Outside the sun had risen, and a broad daylight flooded the wet meadows and the brimming tide of the Severn, catching the sails of the boats that were heeling and trembling on the ripple of the water, which was stirred by the south wind. The king looked towards the window with weariness, expecting, as far as his lethargy allowed, the advent of another monotonous day. The door opened. The faces he saw by the jailer's torch were not those he expected. The king, I say, looked towards them, and his hands trembled, and the moisture on them glistened. They were dark, and one of them was concealed by a silken mask. 3 men entered the dungeon. In the hands of the foremost of the 3 glowed a red hot iron, which was to be the manner of his doom. End of Section 11.
Section 12 of Orpheus in Mayfair and Other Stories and Sketches. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Orpheus in Mayfair and Other Stories and Sketches by Maurice Bering. The Island. "Perhaps we had better not land after all," said Lewis, as he was stepping into the boat. "We can explore this island on our way home." "We'd much better land now," said Stewart. "We shall get to Tenerife tomorrow in any case. Besides, an island that's not on the chart is too exciting a thing to wait for." Lewis gave in to his younger companion, and the 2 ornithologists who were on their way to the Canary Islands in search of eggs were rowed to shore. "They'd better fetch us at sunset," said Lewis as they landed. "Perhaps we shall stay the night," responded Stewart. "I don't think so," said Lewis, but after a pause he told the sailors that if they should be more than half an hour late they were not to wait, but to come back in the morning at 10. Lewis and Stewart walked from the sandy bay up a steep basaltic cliff, which sloped right down to the beach. "The island is volcanic," said Stewart. "All the islands about here are volcanic," said Lewis. "We shan't be able to climb much in this heat," he added. "It will be all right when we get to the trees," said Stewart. Presently they reached the top of the cliff. The basaltic rock ceased, and an open grassy incline was before them, covered with myrtle and cactus bushes, and further off a thick wood, to the east of which rose a hill sparsely dotted with olive trees. They sat down on the grass, panting. The sun beat down on the dry rock. There was not a cloud in the sky, nor a ripple on the emerald sea. In the air there was a strange aromatic scent, and the stillness was heavy. "I don't think it can be inhabited," said Lewis. "Perhaps it's merely a volcanic island cast up by a sea disturbance," suggested Stewart. "Look at those trees," said Lewis, pointing to the wood in the distance. "What about them?" asked Stewart. "They are oak trees," said Lewis. "Do you know why I didn't want to land?" he asked abruptly. "I'm not superstitious, you know, but as I got into the boat I distinctly heard a voice calling out, 'Don't land.'" Stewart laughed. "I think it was a good thing to land," he said. "Let's go on now." They walked towards the wood, and the nearer they got to it, the more their surprise increased. It was a thick wood of large oak trees, which must certainly have been 100 years old. When they had got quite close to it, they paused. "Before we explore the wood," said Lewis, "let us climb the hill and see if we can get a general view of the island." Stewart agreed, and they climbed the hill in silence. When they reached the top, they found it was not the highest point of the island, but only one of several hills, so that they obtained only a limited view. The valley seemed to be densely wooded, and the oak wood was larger than they had imagined. They laid down and rested, and lit their pipes. "No birds," remarked Lewis gloomily. "I haven't seen one. The island is extraordinarily still," said Stewart. The further they had penetrated inland, the more oppressive and sultry the air had become, and the pungent aroma they had noticed directly was stronger. It was like that of mint, and yet it was not mint, and although sweet, it was not agreeable. The heat seemed to weigh even on Stewart's buoyant spirits, for he sat smoking in silence and no longer urged Lewis to continue their exploration. "I think the island is inhabited," said Lewis, "and that the houses are on the other side. There are some sheep and some goats on that hill opposite. Do you see?" "Yes," said Stewart. "I think they are mouflon, but I don't think the island is inhabited all the same." No sooner were the words out of his mouth than he started, and rising to his feet cried, "Look there!" and he pointed to a thin wreath of smoke which was rising from the wood. Their languor seemed to leave them, and they ran down the hill and reached the wood once more. Just as they were about to enter it, Lewis stooped and pointed to a small plant with white flowers and 3 oval-shaped leaves rising from the root. "What's that?" he asked Stewart, who was the better botanist of the two. The flowers were quite white, and each had 6 pointed petals. "It's a kind of garlic, I think," said Stewart. Lewis bent down over it. "It doesn't smell," he said. "It's not unlike moly (Allium flavum), only it's white instead of yellow, and the flowers are larger. I'm going to take it with me." He began scooping away the earth with a knife, so as to take out the plant by the roots. After he had been working for some minutes, he exclaimed, "This is the toughest plant I've ever seen. I can't get it out." He was at last successful, but as he pulled the root, he gave a cry of surprise. "There's no bulb," he said. "Look, only a black root." Stewart examined the plant. "I can't make it out," he said. Lewis wrapped the plant in his handkerchief and put it in his pocket. They entered the wood. The air was still more sultry here than outside, and the stillness even more oppressive. There were no birds, and not a vestige of bird life. "This exploration is evidently a waste of time, as far as birds are concerned," remarked Lewis. At that moment there was a rustle in the undergrowth, and 5 pigs crossed their path and disappeared grunting. Lewis started, and for some reason he could not account for, shuddered. He looked at Stewart, who appeared unconcerned. "They're not wild," said Stewart. They walked on in silence. The place and its heavy atmosphere had again affected their spirits. When they spoke it was almost in a whisper. Lewis wished they had not landed, but he could give no reason to himself for his wish. After they had been walking for about 20 minutes, they suddenly came on an open space and a low white house. They stopped and looked at each other. "It's got no chimney," cried Lewis, who was the first to speak. It was a 1-storied building, with large windows, which had no glass in them, reaching to the ground, wider at the bottom than at the top. The house was overgrown with creepers. The roof was flat. They entered in silence by the large open doorway, and found themselves in a low hall. There was no furniture, and the floor was mossy. "It's rather like an Egyptian tomb," said Stewart, and he shivered. The hall led into a further room, which was open in the centre to the sky, like the impluvium of a Roman house. It also contained a square basin of water, which was filled by water bubbling from a lion's mouth carved in stone. Beyond the impluvium there were two smaller rooms, in one of which there was a kind of raised stone platform. The house was completely deserted and empty. Lewis and Stewart said little. They examined the house in silent amazement. "Look," said Lewis, pointing to one of the walls. Stewart examined the wall and noticed that there were traces on it of a faded painted decoration. "It's like the wall paintings at Pompeii," he said. "I think the house is modern," remarked Lewis. "It was probably built by some eccentric at the beginning of the 19th century who did it up in Empire style." "Do you know what time it is?" said Stewart suddenly. "The sun is set and it's growing dark." "We must go at once," said Lewis. "We'll come back here to-morrow." They walked on in silence. The wood was dim in the twilight. A fitful breeze made the trees rustle now and again, but the air was just as sultry as ever. The shapes of the trees seemed fantastic and almost threatening in the dimness, and the rustle of the leaves was like a human moan. Once or twice they seemed to hear the grunting of pigs in the undergrowth, and to catch sight of bristly backs. "We don't seem to be getting any nearer the end," said Stewart after a time. "I think we've taken the wrong path." They stopped. "I remember that tree," said Stewart, pointing to a twisted oak. "We must go straight on from there to the left." They walked on, and in 10 minutes' time found themselves once more at the back of the house. It was now quite dark. "We shall never find the way now," said Lewis. "We had better sleep in the house." They walked through the house into one of the furthest rooms and settled themselves on the mossy platform. The night was warm and starry, the house deathly still, except for the splashing of the water in the basin. "We shan't get any food," Lewis said. "I'm not hungry," said Stewart, and Lewis knew that he could not have eaten anything to save his life. He felt utterly exhausted, and yet not at all sleepy. Stewart, on the other hand, was overcome with drowsiness. He lay down on the mossy platform and fell asleep almost instantly. Lewis lit a pipe. The vague forebodings he had felt in the morning had returned to him, only increased tenfold. He felt an unaccountable physical discomfort, an inexplicable sensation of uneasiness. And he realized what it was. He felt there was someone in the house besides themselves, someone or something that was always behind him, moving when he moved and watching him. He walked into the impluvium, but heard nothing and saw nothing. There were none of the thousand little sounds, such as the barking of a dog or the hoot of a night bird, which generally complete the silence of a summer night. Everything was uncannily still. He returned to the room. He would have given anything to be back on the yacht, for besides the physical sensation of discomfort and of the something watching him, he also felt the unmistakable feeling of impending danger that had been with him nearly all day. He lay down and at last fell into a doze. As he dozed he heard a subdued noise, a kind of buzzing, such as is made by a spinning wheel or a shuttle on a loom, and more strongly than ever he felt that he was being watched. Then all at once his body seemed to grow stiff with fright. He saw someone enter the room from the impluvium. It was a dim, veiled figure, the figure of a woman. He could not distinguish her features, but he had the impression that she was strangely beautiful. She was bearing a cup in her hands, and she walked towards Stewart and bent over him, offering him the cup. Something in Lewis prompted him to cry out with all his might, "Don't drink! Don't drink!" He heard the words echoing in the air, just as he had heard the voice in the boat. He felt that it was imperative to call out, and yet he could not. He was paralyzed. The words would not come. He formed them with his lips, but no sound came. He tried with all his might to rise and scream, and he could not move. Then a sudden cold faintness came upon him, and he remembered no more till he woke and found the sun shining brightly. Stewart was lying with his eyes closed, moaning loudly in his sleep. Lewis tried to wake him. He opened his eyes and stared with a fixed, meaningless stare. Lewis tried to lift him from the platform, and then a horrible thing happened. Stewart struggled violently and made a snarling noise which froze the blood in Lewis's veins. He ran out of the house with cold beads of sweat on his forehead. He ran through the wood to the shore, and there he found the boat. He rowed back to the yacht and fetched some quinine. Then, together with the skipper, the steward, and some other sailors, he returned to the ominous house. They found it empty. There was no trace of Stewart. They shouted in the wood till they were hoarse, but no answer broke the heavy stillness. Then, sending for the rest of the crew, Lewis organized a regular search over the whole island. This lasted till sunset, and they returned in the evening without having found any trace of Stewart or of any other human being. In the night a high wind rose, which soon became a gale. They were obliged to weigh anchor so as not to be dashed against the island, and for 24 hours they underwent a terrific tossing. Then the storm subsided as quickly as it had come. They made for the island once more, and reached the spot where they had anchored 3 days before. There was no trace of the island. It had completely disappeared. When they reached Tenerife the next day, they found that everybody was talking of the great tidal wave which had caused such great damage and destruction in the islands. End of section 12. Section 13 of Orpheus in Mayfair and Other Stories and Sketches. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Orpheus in Mayfair and Other Stories and Sketches by Maurice Bering. Section 13. The Man Who Gave Good Advice. To Henry Cust. When he was a child, his baby brother came to him one day and said that their elder brother, who was grown up, had got a beautiful small ship in his room. Should he ask him for it? The child, who gave good advice, said, "No, if you ask him for it, he will say you are a spoiled child, but go and play in his room with it before he gets up in the morning, and he will give it to you." The baby brother followed this advice, and sure enough, 2 days afterwards, he appeared triumphant in the nursery, with the ship in his hands, saying, he said I might choose the ship or the picture book. Now the picture book was a coloured edition of Baron Munchausen's adventures. The boy who gave good advice had seen it and hankered for it. As the baby brother had refused it, there could be no harm in asking for it. So the next time his elder brother sent him on an errand, it was to fetch a pincushion from his room. Judging the moment to be propitious, he said to him, "May I have the picture book that baby wouldn't have?" "I don't like little boys who ask," answered the big brother, and there the matter ended. The child who gave good advice went to school. There was a rage for stag beetles at the school. The boys painted them and made them run races on a chessboard. They imagined, rightly or wrongly, that some stag beetles were much faster than others. A little boy called Bell possessed the stag beetle which was the favorite for the coming races. Another boy called Mason was consumed with longing for this stag beetle, and Bell had said he would give it to him in exchange for Mason's catapult, which was famous in the school for the unique straightness of its 2 prongs. Mason went to the boy who gave good advice and asked him for his opinion. "Don't swap it for your caddy," said the boy who gave good advice, "because Bell's stag beetle may not win after all, and even if it does, stag beetles won't be the rage for very long, but a caddy is always a caddy, and yours is the best in the school." Mason took the advice. When the races came off, the stag beetles were so erratic that no prize was awarded, and they immediately ceased to be the rage. The rage for stag beetles was succeeded by a rage for secret alphabets. One boy invented a secret alphabet made of simple hieroglyphics, which was imparted only to a select few, who spent their spare time in corresponding with each other by these cryptic signs. The boy who gave good advice was not of those initiated into the mystery of the cipher, and he longed to be. He made several overtures, but they were all rejected, the reason being that boys of the 2nd Division could not let a 3rd Division squit into their secret. At last the boy who gave good advice offered to one of the initiated the whole of his stamp collection in return for the secret of the alphabet. This offer was accepted. The boy took the stamp collection, but the boy who gave good advice received in return not the true alphabet, but a sham one, especially manufactured for him. This he found out later, but recriminations were useless, besides which the rage for secret alphabets soon died out and was replaced by a rage for aquariums, newts, and natterjack toads. The boy went to a public school. He was a fag. His fag master had 2 fags. One morning the other fag came to the boy who gave good advice and said, "Clark," he was the fag master, "told me 3 days ago to clean his football boots. He's been staying out and hasn't used them, and I forgot. He'll want them today, and now there isn't time. I shall pretend I did clean them." "No, don't do that," said the boy who gave good advice, "because if you say you have cleaned them, he will lick you twice as much for having cleaned them badly. Say you forgot." The advice was taken, and the fag master merely said, "Don't forget again." A little later the fag master had some friends to tea, and told the boy who gave good advice to boil him 6 eggs for not more than 3 minutes and a half. The boy who gave good advice, while they were on the fire, took part in a rag which was going on in the passage. The result was that the eggs remained 7 minutes in boiling water. They were hard. When the fag master pointed this out and asked his fag what he meant by it, the boy who gave good advice persisted in his statement that they had been exactly 3 minutes and a half in the saucepan, and that he had timed them by his watch. So the fag master caned him for telling lies. The boy who gave good advice grew into a man and went to the university. There he made friends with a man called Crawley, who went to a neighbouring race meeting one day and lost 200 or 300 pounds. "I must raise the money from a money-lender somehow," said Crawley to the man who gave good advice, "and on no account must the master hear of it, or he would send me down, or write home, which would be worse." "On the contrary," said the man who gave good advice, "you must go straight to the master and tell him all about it. He will like you twice as much forever afterwards. He never minds people getting into scrapes when he happens to like them, and he likes you, and believes you have a great career before you." Crawley went to the master of the college and made a clean breast of it. The master told him he had been foolish, very foolish, but he arranged the whole matter in such a manner that it never came to the ears of Crawley's extremely violent-tempered and puritanical father. The man who gave good advice got a first in mods, and everyone felt confident he would get a first in greats. He did brilliantly in nearly all his papers. But during the Latin, unseen, a temporary and sudden lapse of memory came over him, and he forgot the English for manubio, which the day before he had known quite well means prize money. In fact, the word was written on the first page of his notebook. The word was in his brain, but a small shutter had closed on it for the moment, and he could not recall it. He looked over his neighbour's shoulder. His neighbour had translated it booty. He copied the word mechanically, knowing it was wrong. As he did so, he was detected and accused of cribbing. He denied the charge. The matter was investigated. The papers were compared, and the man who gave good advice was disqualified. In all his other papers he had done incomparably better than anyone else. When he left Oxford, the man who gave good advice went into a government office. He had not been in it long before he perceived that by certain simple reforms the work of the office could be done twice as effectually and half as expensively. He embodied these reforms in a memorandum, and they were not long afterwards adopted. He became private secretary to Snipe, a rising politician, and persuaded him to change his party and his politics. Snipe, owing to this advice, became a cabinet minister, and the man who gave good advice, having inherited some money, stood for Parliament himself. He stood as a Conservative at a general election, and spoke eloquently to enthusiastic meetings. The wire pullers prophesied an overwhelming majority, when shortly before the poll at one of his meetings he suddenly declared himself to be an independent, and made a speech violently in favour of Home Rule and conscription. The result was that the Liberal Imperialist got in by a huge majority, and the man who gave good advice was pelted with rotten eggs. After this the man who gave good advice abandoned politics and took to finance. In this branch of human affairs he made the fortune of several of his friends, preventing some from putting their money in alluring South African schemes, and advising others to risk theirs on events which seemed to him certain, such as the election of a president or the short-lived nature of a revolution, events which he foresaw with intuition amounting to second sight. At the same time he lost nearly all his own money by investing it in a company which professed to have discovered a manner, cheap and rapid, of transforming copper into platinum. He made the fortune of a publisher by insisting on the publication of a novel which 6 intelligent men had declared to be unreadable. It was called The Conscience of John Digby, and when published it sold by thousands and tens of thousands. But he lost the handsome reward he received for this service by publishing at his own expense, on magnificent paper, an edition of Rabelais' work in their original tongue. He frequently spotted winners for his friends and for himself, but any money that he won at a race meeting he invariably lost coming home in the train on the 3-card trick. Nor did he lose touch with politicians, and this brought about the final catastrophe. A great friend of his, the eminent John Brooke, had the chance of becoming Prime Minister. Parties were at that time in a state of confusion. The question was, should his friend ally himself with, or sever himself forever from Mr. Capex Nissy, the leader of the Liberal aristocracy party, who seemed to have a large following. His friend, John Brooke, gave a small dinner to his most intimate friends in order to talk over the matter. The man who gave good advice was so eloquent, so cogent in his reasoning, so acute in his perception, that he persuaded Brooke to sever himself forever from Capex Nissy. He persuaded all who were present, with the exception of Mr. Shortsight, a pig-headed man who reasoned falsely. So annoyed did the man who gave good advice become with Shortsight, and so excited in his vexation, that he finally lost his self-control and hit him as hard as he could on the head, after Shortsight had repeated a groundless assertion for the 7th time with the poker. Shortsight died, and the man who gave good advice was convicted of wilful murder. He gave admirable advice to his counsel, but threw away his own case as soon as he entered the box himself, which he insisted on doing. He was hanged in gaol at Reading. Many people whom he had benefited in various ways visited him in prison, among others John Brooke, the Prime Minister. It is said that he would certainly have been reprieved but for the intemperate and inexcusable letters he wrote to the Home Secretary from prison. "It's a great tragedy. He was a clever man," said Brooke after dinner when they were discussing the misfortune at Downing Street. "A very clever man, but he had no judgment." "No," said Snipe, the man whose private secretary the man who gave good advice had been. "That's it. It's an awful thing, but he had no judgment." End of section 13.